All right, today we are diving right into the very heart of Plato's Republic. This is the section with his most challenging, his most radical, and you could argue his single most important idea, the concept of the philosopher-king. This is it. This is the intellectual bedrock for his entire ideal state. So, right in the middle of the dialogue, Plato, speaking through Socrates, just drops this absolute bombshell. Think about what an astonishing claim this is. He's saying that every single political problem, every war, every bit of civil unrest is just going to keep going on and on forever, unless the people with the most power are the exact same people who love wisdom the most. And he's not just suggesting this, he's saying it's the only way for humanity to flourish. Now, the immediate reaction, both for his friends in the dialogue and for us today, is probably, "You've got to be kidding me, right? Philosophers, the people with their heads in the clouds, totally disconnected from the real world, how on earth could they be effective rulers?" And that is the central question we're going to unpack. Because to answer it, Plato is going to have to redefine everything: what it means to rule, what it means to be a philosopher, and even what reality itself actually is. So let's just stare this core paradox right in the face. Society tends to look at philosophers as, at best, impractical dreamers. At worst, they're seen as totally useless stargazers. And yet, Plato stakes his entire political project on the claim that these are the only people who are truly fit to govern a just society. And you can see this is the first huge hurdle Plato has to get over. Even his own friends in the dialogue push back on this. They say, "Look, Socrates, in the real world, philosophers are either seen as weirdos, or if they have any talent, they're considered completely useless for anything practical." And it's an easy point to make, isn't it? Politics seems to be about action, about compromise, about power. What does abstract thought have to do with any of that? And here is Plato's absolutely brilliant countermove. He insists that we have fundamentally misunderstood what politics even is. He says it's not a game of who's the strongest or who's the best persuader. It's a craft, a technique, just like medicine or navigation. You see, a doctor doesn't heal you based on a popular vote. They heal you by understanding the reality of the human body. A ship's captain doesn't navigate by asking the passengers where to go. They navigate by understanding the reality of the stars. For Plato, a ruler must govern by understanding reality itself. And that idea brings us to the absolute core of his entire philosophy. To get why the philosopher is the only one fit to rule, you first have to grasp Plato's radical split between what is truly real and the world of shifting appearances that most of us just mistake for reality. This division right here, this is the entire foundation for his political theory. See, the public, the many, we live in the world of appearances. We see things we call beautiful, or actions we call just, but we never grasp what beauty itself is, or what justice itself is. Our world is built on opinions that are fleeting and often contradictory. The philosopher, on the other hand, is after the unchanging essence behind all those appearances. They want the blueprint, not just the shaky copies. And that is the huge difference between having genuine knowledge and just holding an opinion. And for Plato, you cannot build a stable, just state on the shifting sands of opinion. And those blueprints, they have a name: the forms. For Plato, for every single thing in our messy, physical world, there's a perfect, eternal, and unchanging form of it in a higher, intelligible reality. So there are millions of beautiful things, but there's only one form of beauty that allows us to recognize them in the first place. And get this, the forms are not just ideas in our heads. For Plato, they are the objects of true definition, and in fact, they are more real than the physical world we see with our eyes. So if you have a hierarchy of all these forms, it stands to reason that there has to be one at the very top, a single form that gives reality and truth to all the others. And this is it. This is the highest, the most difficult, and the most important concept in all of Plato's thinking: the form of the good. Now, the crucial thing to get here is that the good isn't just another form, like justice or beauty. No, it's the source of them all. It's the ultimate organizing principle that gives order, existence, and value to everything in the universe. Plato finds this concept so profound that he says he can't even define it directly. So instead, he gives us an analogy to help us get a handle on its power: the analogy of the sun. Okay, so let's start with the world we all know. In order to see anything, you need three things, right? You need the eye, which has the power of sight. You need the physical object you're looking at. And, absolutely crucially, you need the sun. Without the sun's light, your vision is useless, no matter how good your eyes are. The sun is the condition that makes seeing possible in the first place. Now let's map this onto the intelligible world of the forms. The mind is like the eye. It has the capacity to know. The forms are like the objects we want to perceive, and the form of the good is like the sun. It provides the light of truth and reality that allows the mind to see or understand the forms. So without the good, there is no truth, there is no reality, and therefore knowledge is impossible. This just brilliantly shows why the Philosopher-King must grasp the form of the good. To rule justly, you have to understand the very source of all reality and all value. Okay, so to really map out this whole journey from ignorance to enlightenment, Plato gives us another incredible image. He asks us to picture a line that's been divided into 4 sections. Each section represents a distinct stage of human thinking, moving from the lowest state of illusion all the way to the highest state of pure understanding. Down at the very bottom, in the realm of opinion, you have imagination. This is seeing only shadows and reflections. You take a step up, and you get to belief, which is perceiving actual physical objects. This is where most of us live our lives. But to get to real knowledge, you have to cross that dividing line. The first stage of knowledge is thought. Think of a mathematician who works with perfect triangles, but has to start from unproven axioms. They're using abstract concepts, but their starting points are still assumptions. And finally, the highest stage of all is understanding. Here, the mind doesn't need assumptions anymore. It grasps the forms directly, and ultimately the form of the good itself, through the power of dialectic. It is a long, hard, upward climb. And now, Plato synthesizes all of it, the 2 worlds, the form of the good, the divided line, into one of the most powerful and famous allegories ever written. The Allegory of the Cave isn't just a story. It is a dramatization of the human condition and the incredibly painful process of what education truly is. I want you to really picture this. Imagine an underground cave. Inside, prisoners have been chained since they were born, forced to face a blank wall. Behind them, there's a fire burning, and between the fire and the prisoners, puppeteers walk back and forth carrying objects that cast shadows on the wall. For these prisoners, who have never known anything else, these flickering shadows aren't just images. They are reality. This is the absolute lowest level of the divided line, pure imagination. Now imagine one of these prisoners is suddenly freed and forced to turn around. The light from the fire would scorch his eyes. He'd be completely confused in pain. The actual objects held by the puppeteers would seem less real to him than the familiar shadows. And this, for Plato, is education. It's not some gentle process of filling up an empty mind. It is a painful, disorienting turning of the entire soul away from comfortable illusions toward a much more difficult truth. Then, he's dragged, totally against his will, out of the cave and into the world above. The sunlight is blinding. At first, he can only manage to look at shadows, then maybe reflections in the water. Slowly, his eyes adjust, until he can see the real things, the trees, the animals, the stars. And then, finally, at last, he's able to look directly at the sun itself. He's done it. He's completed the ascent. He now sees true reality and understands that the sun, which represents the form of the good, is the source of it all. So here we are. We've arrived at the most critical ethical question of the entire dialogue. After this profound, life-altering journey, after achieving genuine knowledge of what's real, what should this person do? Should he just stay up there in the light, enjoying the world of truth for himself? Plato's answer is an emphatic, thundering no. The philosopher's journey isn't for some kind of personal salvation. It's not complete with the final and maybe the most difficult step of all, the return. They have an obligation to go back down into the darkness. And this return is the final exam of a 50-year state-mandated education. I mean, think about it. Decades of physical training, music, advanced mathematics, and philosophy are all designed to do one thing: turn the soul toward the light. But after all that, after they finally get a glimpse of the good, they are required to spend 15 years back down in the cave, taking on practical leadership roles, getting their hands dirty, to gain experience of the world as most people live it. Only then, at 50 years old, are they considered ready to rule. And this brings us to the ultimate paradox. The philosophers do not want to rule. They would much rather spend their time contemplating the eternal forms. They could not care less about the power, the honor, the wealth that obsesses typical politicians. And for Plato, this very reluctance is their single greatest qualification. They accept power not because they're ambitious, but out of a deep sense of duty. And, as Plato says, out of a fear of being ruled by someone worse than themselves. This whole argument is the linchpin of the entire Republic. Plato has built this intricate, step-by-step case to prove that a just state cannot happen by accident. It can't be based on tradition, or on brute force, or on what's popular at the moment. For Plato, a truly just city can only exist if it's founded on unshakable knowledge, a deep understanding of ultimate reality, truth, and value, all of which flows directly from the form of the good. And this, in the end, is both the burden and the responsibility of wisdom. The whole point of this incredibly difficult journey isn't personal enlightenment, it's service. The philosopher does not escape the cave to remain in the light. He returns, because only those who have seen the sun can guide those still in the dark. Which, of course, leaves us with Plato's most enduring challenge. Is it even possible, or for that matter, desirable, to build a society where power belongs only to those who don't actually want it?